first of all, this really isn't, this is kind of a off topic a little bit, but having compared these two, this one will cost more money. Are they buying these or?
They'll be available. Yeah, we'll have them for sale.
Okay. But I found this is a more, this translation is about, it's over 100 years old, I think. And he's trying to do things, he's using a sort of the accepted poetic diction that would have been considered the right way to translate things. Things have changed a lot in 100 years, and so I was reading this. There are parts in here where you just kind of scratch your head a little bit, like, well, what are you trying to say here? Robert Fagles, who has translated a number of both Greek and Latin masterpieces, he's really made an effort to try and be really true to the text, but also to make it understandable. And so I'm in some ways I kind of regret it. I ended up reading this, and just this morning I picked this up. I thought, well, great, everybody else is going to be looking at this, and this doesn't have any line numbers in it, and the pages will be different. So I thought, oh, great, this is going to be confusing. And then I started looking at just the way a couple of key lines were translated, and I thought, oh. So anyway, of the two, I would recommend, if you're really interested in it. Plus, this has the three plays that deal with Oedipus, King Oedipus, and they're put in order of how they were the order chronologically presented in Athens in the theater, not necessarily the way the story would unfold. And the introductions and for the whole book, and then also the introductions for the various plays are really beneficial and very informative. The man Bernard Knox wears his learning lightly. He's not trying to impress you with his erudition. He's just telling you what he knows. And but he says, Knox says that it would be a mistake to think that these don't really, sometimes if people say, we'll call this a trilogy, and really the only existing trilogy of the Greek tragedies is by Aeschylus. That would be the Oresteia. And so he says that this one is, they did Antigone first. I could look up the years, but really what difference does it make? And then there was a passage of time, looks like maybe 10 years, and then he presented Oedipus the King, and then the last one, Oedipus at Colonus. And it says in here that the treatment of some of the characters is a little bit different. So for instance, the treatment of Creon in let's say Oedipus Rex isn't really quite the same as Antigone. So there wasn't an effort, since there was Sophocles lived to be 90 years old, which is remarkable, I think, at that time. And so these plays span probably half of his lifetime. Mm-hmm. So Antigone was written when he was younger and vigorous, and he wrote the last one, Oedipus at Colonus, really when he died before it was ever presented. So he was like 89 years old when he wrote this last one. So there isn't he's not making any effort to try and be consistent. I mean, he's consistent to the subject matter, but he's not worried about, well, here I am speaking for him. I don't know for sure what he's worrying about, but anyway, the fact is he's not thinking like whatever this character was like here has to be the same here. So it's interesting at some point I was glad to know that because, well, it's just informative. It helps you kind of look at each play as a separate entity. There was kind of an interesting, I hope I can find it quickly without having to make you wait. A poet, a comic poet who lived in Athens wrote an epitaph after Sophocles died. And he was an extremely well-respected, popular, well, there were the three, and it's hard to say which one was the most popular, but certainly he was right up there. And the epitaph says, "Blessed Sophocles, who lived a long life, a happy man and a clever one. He composed many fine tragedies and died well, without enduring any misfortune." I thought, well, that's a pretty good epitaph for somebody. And it does make you think, we have this kind of romantic idea, and it's not totally wrong, but that, great artists need to be tortured, that part of their genius is because they had issues with their mom or dad or their dog or whatever, I don't know. And then unless you're tortured, you really don't have anything to say. And here we have Sophocles, who was a man of Athens and lived. He was involved in the political life of the city. He served in public office at various times in various capacities. Was friends. I love the fact that he was friends with Herodotus, the first historian, Greek historian, and Herodotus. I just wonder what those conversations were like. Herodotus loved stories, and just they said he had a sparkling wit, great conversationalist, and he had success in his life. And I don't know how many times he won the prize for the best tragedy, but I think these plays, by the way, were presented. It was a competition, so. Well, I guess that's kind of sliding into the next part here, but which is kind of funny to think about. These plays were normally presented at the end of, around the end of March, and it was part of a festival celebrating the god Dionysus. And the festival would go on for 4 days, and the first 3 days, there would be 3 authors, and they would present their plays, and then on the 4th day, there were judges who were chosen randomly, evidently. They didn't, because it was Athens, everybody has a say in things, so they didn't necessarily go out and get the best, art critic, they just had, regular people, and they would decide of the 3 which one was the best one. So it's funny to think of this as like the Greeks were competitive people, and even in their theater it was competition. And Sophocles took first place. I don't remember. He's like ranked 15 times or something, and he never took third place. If he didn't take first, he always took second. So he wrote. Do you remember how many plays he wrote? I don't know.
The introduction to my edition says 120.
Yeah, so he
I
wrote.
have 7 left.
Yeah, only 7 survived out of 120. And so he took first or second place almost all the time. And because of that, he was. There is a story that says that his first public appointment was partly because of the acclaim that he received after the performance of Antigone. I think they made him a general. And he, as a matter of fact, that when Sophocles was living, that was during the Peloponnesian War, and so he served as a general, and I can't remember exactly where he was sent, but he didn't dishonor himself. But so that's about, to be honest with you, we don't really know all that much about Sophocles. We really don't. So we know a little bit more about, do you want to say anything else
I
about?
was just gonna say, it's kind of a weird idea that you would say, all right, we have this award-winning playwright, let's make him a general.
Yeah.
And that it tells you something about Athens and the Greeks.
Yeah, so, you know, well, it was a truly egalitarian environment that they lived in, and so what seems to us rather strange and maybe imprudent, you know, they would pick people to go to be generals for different reasons, maybe not the reason that we would choose. And then to turn around, and if they botched the job, they would be dishonored and possibly exiled. So, you know, so yeah, it's a pretty precarious thing. You know, the honors are great, but also the dishonor is pretty great too. And they had no problem with exiling people. I believe they exiled. Who was the general at the Battle of Salamis? Was it Themistocles? I don't know. So they had no problem if you did something and you got on the wrong side of the polis of, you know, showing you the door, and so it was pretty brutal in that regard. But anyway, going back to the theater, so each author wrote if I understood this correctly, you know, several plays, because the theater began at daybreak and it ended at the end of the day. So people would come into the theater, which was on I don't know what side of the Acropolis it was on, but anyway, there on one side there was a theater, a hillside, and it was dedicated to Dionysus, and that's where the plays were put on, and people would file in at dawn, and they were in there all day. Now there were some breaks and things like that, but for 3 days they did that, and it was 3 days of tragedy. On the fourth day, they had some other kinds of entertainment, comedies, different kinds of things. But it's remarkable, and they said that everybody went. They think the theater would hold about 14,000. I know it was at least 14,000 people could file in there, and they would even let prisoners out of jail so they could go to these. So it's like this was one of the most significant things in the life of the polis. That these plays, you know, we think of plays as just kind of a form of entertainment. You know, it's like, well, you know, hey, I could go see this if I want to pay the ticket. There wasn't any admission. Well, I guess later on they did start charging a little bit of admission. The plays were sponsored or put on by wealthy citizens. So rather than getting, you know, a tax on your income like we suffer, the city would just basically come to some well-to-do person and say, "Oh, good news! You have been chosen to sponsor one day of the plays." You know, and then they had to cough up the money for the you know, whatever expenses there were, certainly for the costumes and they weren't involved in any artistic way. They just had to kind of pay the way. So it was a free festival, and and as I said, it was tied in with this cult to Dionysus, which is interesting because, you know, Sophocles wrote these Theban plays, and Dionysus was always associated with Thebes.
Right.
Did you guys want to talk about festivals at all?
Well, maybe even before that, you were talking about the egalitarian nature of kind of their social arrangement, and the fact that I think it's unique that, you know, we live in a time of private association, right? So you attend what you're interested in attending,
Right.
you join what club you're interested in joining. We're kind of fragmented in that way. Whereas everything we're discussing here is very public, and I think that really informs the tragedy that we're reading today is this understanding of, and some of this handout is, where did this come from, Howard?
That came from,
The handout I just gave you talks a little bit about that. I mean, I'm trying to read it now, but
if you're interested in the Greeks, this book by HDF Kiddo called The Greeks, you can still get it, it's in print, and it's very well written and informative, and he's English, and he's got a sense of humor, you know, he makes, you know, he's not too serious. But the chapter in here about the polis, which, did you give everybody a copy of that? We'll talk about that in a minute. But this was part of it was interesting, you said the public life of the community, because our word for liturgy comes from, how would you translate that from the Greek?
It's the work of the people.
The work of the people, the public work of the people. So you could say, in all honesty, that these plays were liturgy. Now that seems odd to us because we think of liturgy in a different and somewhat restricted way from a Greek would just say, well, this is part of the public thing that we do. And tied in with this festival, and it's interesting that it was tied into the cult of Dionysus, because Dionysus, there are different, as you know, there are the Olympian gods and there are the younger gods, and he's even a younger god, and took him a little while to be accepted. Where that cult came from, do you know? I mean, they always say it came from the East.
Yeah.
You know?
I don't know much about it.
I don't
think
either.
there's some...
Probably from the Persian War.
Okay.
No, I don't know.
Well, it might be.
And so the cult to Dionysus, there's a little bit of ambivalence to it, because if you think about, well, to juxtapose that with the cult to Apollo representing the arts, but also reason, moderation, self-control. The Dionysian cult is actually celebrating ecstasy and release and abandonment and some other, drunkenness and maybe some sexual licentiousness, and I mean, they kind of go along with it.
It reminds me a little bit of in like the Indo-Aryan peoples, they have soma, and the Persians have hauma, which is this, they don't really know what it is, but this kind of sacramental food or drink that brings ecstasy. So that might be why they suspect the Dionysian cult comes from the East. It is similar in that respect.
It is true that so in some ways when we go to the movies or we go to see a play or even read a book perhaps, that there is a certain sense of that you're kind of, if you're really drawn into it. I mean, we've all had that experience of some work of art that actually sort of makes us lose track of time. Like all of a sudden you think, oh my gosh, I've been reading this book for 4 hours, or whatever. I don't ever do binge viewing, but I hear my kids talking about watching Breaking Bad for like 3 days in a row, and I don't do that because my wife would disapprove, greatly. But you can kind of see that. I mean, because the phenomenon of sort of like losing yourself in this story, it is very Dionysian, in a way that for a short period of time you allow yourself. Just think, I mean, they go to the theater, they're there all day long. I don't know what they did about food. Maybe there were concessions.
I was thinking about that too.
Wine here, ice cold wine.
Get your peanuts. As you were talking about liturgy and drama, I was thinking I think there's an aspect of that in Catholic liturgy. Mm-hmm. Our liturgy, especially when it's done right, has a dramatic aspect to it. I mean, just we represent every Mass the Last Supper, and not just the Last Supper, but all of the act of Christ's Passion.
Right,
So
and
there's
it
a-
takes you out of this time,
That's right.
and you're presented into a different
Yeah.
time.
And then we
Yeah.
have liturgical actions. I was just thinking about, like, for instance, the Palm Sunday procession, where we read the story, but in a way we kind of act it out,
Mhm.
or we're supposed to.
Oh, yeah.
And there's
Well-
and that's not the only thing like that.
Well, with
Good Friday is a lot like this.
With
as well.
liturgy, and now I'm thinking more, in the way we think of it, but it applies to this too. You can't just be a bystander or an observer.
Right.
In other words, to really do it, you participate in it. Now, what that participation is can vary, but almost by definition, you have to surrender yourself to it. In other words, and the people that go to Mass and find it boring, they probably are. They haven't really kind of taken that next step where they're actually giving themselves up to the liturgy. Because if you can do that, well then, the boredom goes away and time goes away too. So, an Easter vigil, well done, sometimes, and it's hard to get it well done, but if it is well done, you don't really think, oh, this thing has gone over 3 hours. What are we doing here? It's not like that. You sort of lose yourself to it. So, anyway, the fact that this was I want to maybe say one more thing, and then we'll come back to that later on, because we're going to talk a little bit about tragedy. Like I overheard, said, like, what was it? Wasn't a fun read.
Yeah.
It wasn't Antigone is not a fun read. Well, for that matter, if you don't think this isn't a fun read, you're really not going to think Oedipus Rex is a. I mean, but
Right.
So it's strange to think that there would be at a festival for Dionysus that they would concentrate on tragedy, and that seems, at least at first, that paradoxical.
No,
I
but
think.
there's an aspect of the Dionysian myth that's tragic.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I'm trying to remember how it all goes, but basically a bunch of wild women tear a boy apart.
The Maenads. Yeah.
So it's.
Well, one of the very first myths that has Dionysius in it, he comes to Thebes, and the king, I think his name is Pentheus, tries to suppress the cult,
Right.
and the queen goes out into the woods, and she joins the merrymaking with all the other women, and then as punishment, the king is ripped to shreds by the women, including his wife. I mean, so there is something kind of frightening about it all. Makes you not want to cross your spouse,
Yeah. You can see why the Romans weren't really hip on this coming to Rome.
Yeah. So the stories, of course, the subject matter of these tragedies were all received. So that's another thing which gives it a certain kind of liturgical aspect, is that we have to remember that they didn't have scripture. There wasn't any direct, there wasn't the same kind of revelation. What they had were stories that go back to the beginning of time, that have been handed down from age to age. A lot of those have to do with the gods, the patron deities of their cities, about Greek heroes. And so there wasn't any effort on the part of Aeschylus or Sophocles or Euripides to kind of come up with new material. They would take the accepted material and then present it and rework it. So this, I don't know how much Aeschylus did that. I don't know, but I know Sophocles certainly, well, one of the things that Sophocles would do, okay, there were two things that you could do. One would be that just when everybody thought they knew what was going to happen in the story, you kind of shock people a little bit by a subtle change. The thing that Sophocles was known for was, since the audience already knows the story, but the actors in their acting are in time and they don't know. So you put the audience in a strange position where they're kind of omniscient. They already know the story, and they already know the outline, they already know the outcome. But the people down there, on the stage, don't. And so, you end up with this opportunity for dramatic irony, where a character will say things, and you get a lot of that in Oedipus Rex, not quite so much in Antigone, but Creon, after a while, if you already know what's going to happen, he says some things in here where you just kind of cringe, like, oh man, if you only knew. So it puts the audience in a strange position of being almost like outside of time, and that your knowledge of what's going to go on is you're not limited by time and place. So you in a way you're kind of participating. You're sort of seeing things from the point of view of one of the gods. It's kind of a strange thought. But Sophocles especially exploited that in his plays, and so that was one of the benefits of the myths. The people loved to hear the stories, and there is something strange about myths. I mean, they're still popular today. I just finished 6 years in the trenches over teaching middle school, and the kids they read a lot of garbage. I'm not going to deny that, but they really are fascinated by Greek myth. But what age group do you teach?
Oh, I don't teach, but I just have a bunch of kids.
Oh, okay.
They're fascinated.
Do we have any other teachers in here? Okay. What age group do you teach?
K through 12 for 38 years.
So pretty much,
Pretty much whatever I needed to in history, literature, writing.
would you agree that the Greek myths continue to they seem to fascinate?
Yeah, and I think that's why if you can direct that toward Chronicles of Narnia and things like that too, it's useful because of those illusions. But yeah, they always enjoy the myth unit a lot.
What's difficult is now, really has anything to do with this, but like there's the new junkie Percy Jackson series that I can't stand, but my kids love because even my 17-year-old, because she's read the original Greek myths, she read Oedipus when she was like in 6th grade and loves it and has read all this other stuff. Then she reads Percy Jackson and she they enjoy this out there, bringing it into modern day type of
And
thing.
kids are pretty
Although it's
hard.
crap.
Well, some of them are. It's kind of like
I mean, literally,
there's fake myths, and there are real myths.
they're good
But that
stories,
is
I guess. They're entertaining stories, but the writing is just like I read one of them. And I'm like, really? Like this isn't challenging. It's like
The,
5th grade.
One of the things that's kind of peculiar about myths is that they can be written well, they can be written poorly. Either way, whatever attraction there is it's not really about the language.
Right.
That was I stole that idea. By the way, I don't have any original ideas. They always get me in trouble when I come up with one. But W.H. Auden, I don't know who first coined the idea mythopoetic, but so all those guys that were writing at that time but one of the and C.S. Lewis talks about it, that there are certain writers where whatever the power of the story, it really is like, so for instance, C.S. Lewis acknowledges George MacDonald is kind of an inconsistent writer, as far in some ways. But his stories there is something captivating about them. And it's true about the myths, that there are some that have been retold in a really in beautiful language and it doesn't seem to make any difference. So whatever the appeal of the story, it has to do with something other than just the words. It has to do something with it, it's revealing something about something that's very hard to define.
Yep.
And so they really function in the realm of wonder, I think.
Yeah.
They make you ponder. They don't give up answers very easily, but the reason I'm dwelling on this is that it's almost ideal for the material to work on. Now, at the same time, these myths, because of their quality, they end up always being kind of current at the same time. So they exist in some timeless period, and yet they always end up having some, you kind of say, oh, well, that kind of, and so I don't know if, when Antigone was presented, I don't know if Sophocles, with the character of Creon, did he have somebody in mind, do you think, or whatever? I mean, certainly the subject about the inherent conflict that you would find in the polis is in there, and how there are different claims. And of course, the Greeks had a pantheon, and so if you're devoted to this god, well, then you're always running the risk of somehow maybe disappointing this god, or so you have the claims of the gods, and they're contrary sometimes, and then we have the life of the city, and there are the claims that what does it mean to be a citizen? Well, what do I owe to my family? And certainly in Antigone, that's a big one right there, is the conflict between the what is owed to the city and what is owed to the family, and then the gods who kind of represent either one of those allegiances. So so there's always a Athenian, I'm sure, even though the story was ancient, could still sort of see there were issues there that were very current and kind of relevant. Go ahead.
I've got a question about, I'm thinking about the performers and the audience and this interaction between them. And I'm told that Shakespearean plays, there was a lot more interaction than our modern plays. You go to a play today, and the audience sits back, and they're expected to keep their mouths shut, and everything goes dark, and I guess Wagner brought that to music and dramatic presentations of darkening the audience, so that your whole attention's
Right.
up there, and there's nothing good. And I guess Shakespeare's plays, they would say things. Some of the lines are directed to people in.
Well, yeah, the cheap seat, the peanut gallery, the people right there at the foot of the
Right.
stage. Those guys would come in, they'd bring in probably some bottle of ale and
Yeah.
something, sneaky cheese, and they're talking and no, this idea about like if we go to the theater, you must be quiet because this is art. I don't think that was sort of the way things worked in Elizabethan England, and I don't know for
That was my question.
for the Greeks, I don't know. I've never read one thing or another. My guess would be that they're a little bit more quiet.
Okay.
That'd be my guess.
They probably had to.
Yeah, they would. Well, yeah. The Globe really wasn't a very big theater, really, to be honest with you. So you're kind of right there, but if you're in this,
14,000 people.
14,000 people outside Now, the acoustics later on, you know, I visited a Greek theater, but it wasn't in Athens, I can't remember where it was. It was someplace in Greece. But the acoustics of that theater were amazing, that you know, you could go to the very top row of the theater and someone could be standing on the stage and they could talk in a normal voice and you could hear them perfectly. It was really uncanny. Now, I'm not sure I don't know if that was the case in Athens, I don't know. But either way, you know, if you want to listen to what they have to say, and it is somewhat word-driven, I mean, there was spectacle, but not like what we have today, you'd want to be able to attend.
Yeah.
So
Most of the action takes place off stage, right?
Yeah.
And they talk about what's happened. Yeah.
So, what do you want to talk about the polis a little bit? So everybody got a handout, is that correct? On the polis?
Sorry, you here?
No,
You have highlighted or something?
I've got one.
Yeah. Well, you know, actually, since you have this, you know, you can read it at your leisure. But what the professor is attempting to do here is give you sort of an extended definition of how do we understand this word, which we normally translate city-state, and he, right off the bat, he argues that that's a little bit misleading. So as a matter of fact, maybe I'll just read the first paragraph here, but polis is the Greek word which we translate city-state. It is a bad translation because the normal polis was not much like a city and was very much more than a state. But translation, like politics, is the art of the possible. Since we have not got the thing which the Greeks call the polis, we do not possess an equivalent word. From now on, we will avoid the misleading term city-state and use the Greek word instead. And in this chapter, we will inquire how this political system arose, and then we will try to reconstitute the word polis and recover its real meaning by watching it in action. It may be a long task, but all the time we shall be improving our acquaintance with the Greeks. And then he goes on and he begins looking at this word as it's presented in different contexts.
And I apologize, it's impossible, no matter which way, how much I think about it, or which way I put it in the copier, I always get them stapled in a weird way. I'm left-handed, I don't know if that's something, I always blame everything on the fact I'm left-handed. So anyways,
Printers
Yeah,
are made for
well, Father said during his homily that, you know, God has created each one of us with sort of a special, you know, like
Something
what are you
special.
made for? Yeah, and
Yeah.
yours is to make bad Xerox
make bad
copies.
Xerox. It's just,
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, see, when you print them like this, you have to turn one, then you have to flip the other one around, and anyway, yeah.
Fearfully
one more
wonderfully
step that I'm
made.
capable
We'll
of
have
doing. Give me a
a
workshop
little
later.
class on that later on. So he ends up, you know, the first thing he says is that, well, you know, and this is a little bit, and I've read this several times, you know, how many people actually lived in Athens or in one of these communities. And if you go to page 66, in the first full paragraph, it says, in fact, only 3 Polae had more than 20,000 citizens. Syracuse, I don't even know how to pronounce that. You guys know?
Archivos?
Okay, in Sicily and in Athens. So we're looking at, well, let's see. I'm trying to think, what town in Kansas has around 20,000 people in it? Unfortunately, because of the way, you know, our flight to the city, we are getting huge cities and dwindling towns. It's like, can anybody think of a 20,000 member? I don't know, how many people live in Hutch?
I know, I was about to say Hutchinson, but I don't know.
You know, it'd be nice if you had some sort of, you know, visualize something. I lived in Fort Scott for 10 years, and Of course, they fudged on the population. I think about 7,000 people lived there. So it would be bigger than Fort Scott, probably, I don't know, maybe it's like Pittsburgh. I don't know. How many people live in Chanute?
10,000 is what they say, and I think they fudged their
Emporia
numbers
has
too.
24.
Emporia does?
Hays, Kansas has 20,000, Liberal has 20,000, Pittsburgh has 20,000.
Okay, so, that's interesting. So, and of course, you know, he says in there, a lot of it depends on how you count. Are we talking about citizens? In which case, well, what about spouses and children?
Yeah.
You know, slaves could throw it off a little bit, but then he says, you know, most Greeks, unlike wealthy Romans, most Greeks, you were lucky if you had one slave. So, you know, the slave number is not going to probably skew things quite as much, but still, though, we're trying, so we know it's a smaller community. And
I have to disagree. I think it's about the size of Wichita.
do you think so?
Yeah,
Athens
the
is the
number
size
they
of
give
Wichita.
is 350,000 people. That's counting citizens,
Well-
slaves, everything. And that's about right. And you do have to, if you're going to have your entire adult male population be soldiers.
That's the population of Attica.
Attica, well, yeah, said
So-
county, Wichita. Yeah, greater Wichita.
Okay.
350,000 people. And that's probably, I don't know, maybe a little physically larger than Attica, but the same scale of population. And, you know, when you think about the upper class gathering at Century 2 or at the field house, you have about that scale of community and people, and a lot of, yeah, we don't have slaves, but we have the working class. Me? No, actually.
Well, in there, it's a couple of pages later, and he talks about just what you were saying, that, and what reminds me of the play we're talking about today is that when something was said to the polis, it was being said to each individual member of the polis, and that there wasn't this kind of anonymity, even if maybe in the way that it actually played out there was, the perception was that when something was said publicly, it was, if I make an announcement publicly, you know, now we have Facebook or something, you know, we billboard things now, right? So we just make kind of like privatized statements. But the idea here is that when something is proclaimed, it's one person saying it to every other individual person in that community. And I might be getting ahead here of you, Howard, but as you're talking about the kind of citizenship, and you're talking about the different, you know, we've got the landowners and, you know, male, female, all these different distinctions. But as far as like, what does it mean to be included in the polis? And by the end of the chapter, you know, he gets to that of saying that, like, it has this inclusivity, but they weren't interested in the same types of inclusivity that we are, right? So they weren't fighting for suffrage for all these different groups. They weren't fighting for naturalization of all these outsiders.
Right.
So they weren't worried about, you know, making sure everybody had a political stake in the sense that we think about it today. But yet there was a higher view of why these people were connected to the polis. So what was the purpose of the polis? It was to teach, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that was the reason that all these people are gathered together. That was like their mission, is to teach and instruct, and to invite people really to a liturgy type experience. But it wasn't that like I get a vote or I get my rights, right? It wasn't about license. It was that everyone's invited to kind of, you know, bask in the glow of the city, if you will, or to kind of feed off of it.
I was thinking about this earlier, that people kind of had a civic duty to attend
Right.
these plays.
Right.
That's an interesting idea.
Right, and
That's
it's something handed over. I mean, that whole idea of tradition is that, like, we tend to reject tradition because when something's handed down to me, I then see if it fits in with my preferences, conceptions, my contemporary experience, rather than just receiving it as something that's handed down. It's a very different view, and so, again, not to jump, you know, because we're going to save our discussion of the play until after our first break, but that all informs why this is such a big deal, right? Because if my community is just a place that I happen to live, it's just randomly where my home happens to be, and if every member of that community is just somebody who is expected not to be a threat to me, hopefully somehow going to benefit me, but I don't have a real relationship, that changes everything. If that's the way we view the polis, if we simply exchange polis for city, as the author warns us not to do, then none of this makes sense. None of the idea of offending your city is no big deal at all.
Yeah, Howard mentioned exile, and I think it sounds horrible, but I think some of us might think, well, you just have to move to another town.
We
Yeah,
choose
no,
to.
big deal. I mean, okay, you get if I had to move to Oklahoma, that would stink. I know, but you know, I mean, gotta live somewhere, you know.
But that was a horrific. I mean, some people chose death over exile.
Oh, yeah.
It's just to be estranged from your polis was.
Yeah, no, that you know, in the Apology, Socrates was
That's right.
was offered the chance for exile,
That's right.
and he said, "No, are you kidding?
Yeah.
I choose death over exile.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'd rather die in Athens than live someplace else."
Also, Athens is like New York, big time. 300,000 people, everybody else is 20, McPherson's your next biggest place. Do you want to go there? And also the fact that of
I'd
this,
rather die.
McPherson's a nice town.
No.
yeah,
I know.
and then also a main form of camaraderie. 15,000 men comprise the Athenian army. That's every able-bodied man and a Corvette-type assemblage of armor. And they train together all the time, constantly. And so that's one community that's working there. I don't know if the women even got to vote. I kind of doubt they did. The Ostraka, hey, get him out of here. Yeah, I think you have to, and then if you add in trade, which that is the center of trade of the world, where a huge amount of that Athenian population is going to be people who are there on business from out of town, who reside in that. So between trade and the teamwork of the warfare, you explain, I mean, you see that's where a lot of cohesion is going to come.
Right, but like you mentioned, trade. So one of the things in this chapter was he kind of debunks the idea that the reason that they were these independent city-states or poli is that it was a geographic necessity or whatever. He kind of debunks that as saying that like there's these polises that are close to one another. There's no natural barriers, and they simply choose to be independent of each other. That they're not. So I think again, the modern mind. I think we tend to. I mean, I shouldn't assume what we all think, but we tend to kind of look at things as like mutual advantage, right? Of like, we need a certain amount of land to supply all of our diversity. So you look at the United States and, look at like what we grow in different parts of the country, and then you look at all the expansion that we have to do in order to get what we want. And so we tend to do that, with businesses, for example. So you're mentioning exile. It doesn't really resonate with us because we just, if we can make a few more bucks somewhere else, we just go there, right? I mean, that people when people graduate from high schools in Wichita, I shouldn't assume, I guess, but most of them aren't concerned with, I want to stay home. They're like, well, where can I make money?
Yeah.
I go to Kansas City or wherever. And so we kind of tend to look at those associations based on either necessity or at least some sort of practicality or advantage. But I thought it was interesting that he kind of looks at that a little bit and says, no, there's something about this independence that they really fought for and that was really ingrained in their hearts that I thought was significant. And again, that just informs this story of like the idea that you would be faced with death before offending your city, and that justice could require such drastic punishments, exile or death, for an offense against a city. I mean, we tend to think of cities as not being things, right? I mean, it's just kind of this group of people, and so we call it a city.
Geographical
Right.
area,
So if I understand the scale of this, if one city-state goes to war with another, it could be a community that's just a few get exiled to that community, just a few miles down the road. There's also these trade agreements, probably, and business agreements between those communities as well. So it's almost like it's like a hyper little community.
Because they're on foot, they're largely on foot, or with messengers running around, we saw a lot of messengers running around. No electricity, our polis seems to be some sort of cyber world.
Yeah.
Like if we had everybody raise their hand if they're on Facebook, for instance, who has a Facebook account? All those without Facebook accounts, watch us.
What's that?
We're not your polis, we're not your polis, we're a different polis.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you're on the same polis as those under 25.
Well, we're in the polis that doesn't talk to each other because we're not on Facebook, so there.
I don't know, I'm one of the youngest in my wife's swim class, and all the old ladies that can hardly drive there are on Facebook, so.
Yeah, all the kids say Facebook's not cool, so I
It's
don't know.
not, it's for.
You know, you hear what I'm saying.
Yeah, no,
When Facebook used to
our sense of
be
community is
for
something
all
different,
That's the polis that.
yeah.
It's a different polis.
I think a lot of it is just we don't have loyalty to hardly anything, let alone our city. We don't. I do feel like Wichita is different from a lot of places I've lived. I've lived in a lot of places, but
We have a flag.
we have. But there is a lot of civic pride here. And it feels, I don't know, I have a sense that it's kind of growing. I don't know if it's growing in a healthy way. But there people are concerned about that. But still, it's a different kind of loyalty than,
Mhm.
if Hutchison marched on Wichita, who would take up arms, like from the normal people to defend her? I don't know. I don't know. Or
Yeah,
like
I
you're saying-
would only take up arms if you're gonna mess with my stuff.
Right.
Somebody from Hutchinson comes by and want to break into my house, okay, fine, and I'm locked and loaded, but
If they want to replace their city council,
Right.
but otherwise, it's like, well, whatever,
Didn't Dante have the same feeling about exile? When he was
Oh,
exiled from
that's
Florence?
interesting.
With the Italian city-states, they were
Right.
probably a parallel to
Mhm.
this in a later century.
I would think so.
Because Dante hated me.
Oh, yeah.
He was never at home.
So,
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
If you look at him and look at the Italian city-states of the early Renaissance, that's a parallel to this.
so towards the end of that chapter, after he's kind of looked at this word in different ways, he writes that the word polis originally just meant citadel. So people wanted some place where they could defend themselves. They wanted a stronghold. And then where the stronghold was, there were obviously was going to be a patronal deity that they would appeal to. So you end up in the citadel. Well, there's a temple. Well, if there's going to be a temple, then pretty soon that's whoever's in charge. They're going to be living on the citadel. So you have the royalty lives there. But then, it kind of expands out and it ends up really meaning more than that to something where he says, polis begins to mean the whole communal life of the people, political, cultural, moral. He doesn't say religious, but he talks about religion, that life is everything to them. And that helps us understand a little bit when Aristotle says that man is a political animal. Man, by definition, is a political animal. What he really is saying is man is the animal that thrives in the polis. That man does not thrive when he's off, by himself. It makes no sense. Like Greek would have said that was crazy. And the word idiot means a person who doesn't take part in the life of the polis. Literally means that's what an idiot is. And so to become fully human, at least at this point, they would have thought, well, yeah, you have to participate in the life of the polis.
So that came up, oh, sorry.
Well, in the Mishnah, there are a few Greek words that the Hebrews borrowed from the Greeks, and one of them is idiotes, and it's basically a heretic when it shows up in the Mishnah. So it's interesting.
That makes sense.
Someone who's doing their own thing and
Right.
isn't concerned about the communal life.
Well, like, that came up in the Odyssey, I mean, the Cyclops, that's how they were
Yeah.
described as being
Right.
on their own little,
Right. and
like
the
that was
way-
the first description, is that
Yeah.
they don't come together, they don't go to council, they just
Yeah, they,
exist.
yeah, they don't
just do
till
their
the
own thing.
ground,
Yeah.
they don't have a meeting place to debate,
Civilization.
Right.
So it pretty quickly Homer is just letting you know, these people don't live in a polis.
Right.
And therefore they're barbarians.
Yeah.
And
Well,
that
there's-
doesn't stop Odysseus from wanting to go
Well, yeah.
visit them anyway, so.
Yeah, he doesn't heed the warning, but there's something, and he talks about it in this chapter too, is that there's something real that holds it together, and that idea of the Greek view of cosmos, right? That there's this connection, and that justice is required for it to be held together. Not just on a practical level, not like, well, if you go too fast, it might be dangerous for me, and my kids playing in the street. Not just this real kind of small level, but this larger level that and the gods are involved, of course, but that this whole fabric has to be maintained, or else everything's going to fall apart. And so the idea that we tend to isolate everything as to the pleasures of the individual person, right? So justice is served when all of our individual fragmented rights are preserved, right? So to us, the idea of somebody being punished severely, we don't know what context to put that in, because we say, well, what about this individual person's rights? But to them, there's a fabric that's got to be upheld for everybody, and somebody has to suffer. Like, there's suffering involved in that, and it's all just kind of part of this whole fabric, this cosmos,
Yeah.
and that a price has to be paid. So if there's an affront made to the polis, a price has to be paid. This person maybe has to go. This person has to suffer.
Right.
Because the stakes are high. The stakes are very high for your membership in the polis. So again, it's interesting to kind of try to put yourself into this
Yeah.
perspective.
Right.
Before reading something like that.
I know we need to move on, but I was just wondering, so last week we talked about this kind of ambivalence towards the city that you get in Gilgamesh and other ancient works. That, the cities where culture happens, but there's this nostalgia for the wild and for a non-city setting. So is the polis necessarily urban, I guess is my question. Or do the Greeks just not have the same kind of ambivalence?
That's a good question.
I don't think the countryside was very far away. I mean, I
Yeah.
can't remember which dialogue it is
That's
where,
my impression as well.
oh gosh, which one is it? But anyways, Socrates just walks a short distance out of Athens, and the way he describes it, they're out in the countryside, and he says, "Oh, what a lovely place this is. Why don't we sit down and we'll talk philosophy?" And they put their feet in the running water of this brook, and they're sitting under the shade of a plane tree. So, and they haven't really walked that far.
Yeah.
So
I think
I can't really imagine, like, if there's 300, and I don't know, I can't really quite get my mind around how this all works out, but, I think that there was countryside pretty soon, and that's still considered part of the polis, so I don't know.
And the towns are all close together, so
Well,
Israel's like this. You can see, you're in one town here, and you can see a town on that hill over there, and you can, it's a different, we don't have sprawling
Yeah.
cities, perhaps.
Well, you
like-
mentioned sight, and the author of this chapter mentioned that, even just the importance of being able to see the fields, right? And so, here, like, if you live in a big city, you don't see, so he said it was important that they saw the fields that supplied their grain. For example, there's this real connectivity that they're witnessing all this, they're really a part of it.
I was just up in Chicago, and we went took the grandkids to the Lincoln Park Zoo, and sure enough, part of that zoo is that they've got a farm there. You know, they've got this little rinky-dink little red barn, and you can go and you can look at a cow and yeah, so you have to supply that somehow or other, you know. But like the kids look at those, the cow is just as strange as an orangutan to him, you know.
It's all foreign, believe it, at our zoo. Matter of fact, I took a picture of it last time I was there, because in the barn exhibit, there was a draft horse there, and it said that, you know, at one time, it would have been expected that every family had a draft horse, and then on the bottom, it was kind of funny, because like in the same frame, in the very bottom of the frame, I could get the words in bold, "This is an endangered species."
Yeah.
And so, I mean, just the idea that something that
Draft
was...
horse is an endangered
This
species?
particular kind of, it said it was endangered.
I
So,
didn't know that.
yeah. What do you think? Let's take a break.
Yeah, let's take a break.
We're going to take a break, and then we're going to start off the next session. Is that okay if we start off? We're going to start off the next session with some small group discussion. So take a short break. We've got...
Are you going to give them the question now, or wait until afterwards?
well, let's do it now. Is that good?
I think so. Let's think about it.
Yeah, think about it, so you can start your discussions during the break. So the question is, and we didn't really talk about the question, but I think a good...
Wait, there was a question
There
of
was a-
whether we should have a question or not.
We're talking about having... Yes. So the question I would be interested in hearing you talk about, and that we'll talk about after the break at some point, is who is the hero of the story?
Yeah.
And who's the villain of the story, and why?
Yeah.
Okay, and then, so we'll give you, so take a short break, get back together. I don't know if you want to just let them find their own groups, or...
Yeah.
Just figure it out.
No, we don't. Let it be organic.
And then we'll do that for a few minutes, then we'll get back together.
Should we go run off?
Yeah. Is it online, or do you have a hard copy?
I have hard copy.
Okay.
Yeah.
Be interested in, and then when people actually talk about it, because like somebody asked Anthony Eston the question like that in the Q&A when he was here about Dante. Like, it was really interesting hearing him talk about it. Whereas at face value, you're like, you want to hear about translating? I'd be like, why would that be interesting? But it's because I've never really done it.
This guy is a poet. He's also
Whose is that?
Paul Roche.
Okay.
I don't know much about him. It was done in 1958, and this was like
I had some other work that he did. So
I believe he was a Catholic from his. This is my favorite line here. Thou odoriferous stench, sound rottenness, is not at all the same as you sweet smell, healthy decay. But who will say the meaning is different? In Xanadu did Kublai Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, bears almost no emotional resemblance to. Kublai Khan decided upon a fine fun dome in Xanadu.
A fine fun dome. That's cool, yeah.
Is it?
Something to be desired.
Just putting the words there doesn't catch the
Right.
translation.
one of you guys want to read the speech by Creon? I suppose we ought to read it out of here, right? Since
That's probably
Why don't you read it? You've got a nice cadence. All right, well, let's get started here. Sounds like we had some good conversations. You kind of picked up that was sort of a trick question, but we'll get to some of those questions in a minute. I think we're going to start with Howard's going to read something from our text, and then we'll open it up.
This is well, if you've got this edition, I'm going to start on page 7 at the bottom. It would be Creon's his opening speech, and maybe we'll try to put things in context as we go along here, so the play opens up with, Antigone and her sister, and Antigone's telling her about, evidently her sister hasn't heard Creon's proclamation that their brother has to be left unburied. And she asks her sister if she will join her, and sister is, well, I don't know, what would you say? Thinks it's unwise.
Yeah.
She don't get involved.
She seems to be sort of the voice of caution early on. And Antigone kind of wheels on her, and then the chorus comes out, and there's kind of a poetic retelling about the 7 against Thebes, about what happened in the battle. And then Creon, and of course the chorus, they're elated because a catastrophe has been averted. And then, let's see, I think I'll pick it up right before Creon's speech. So this would be kind of right below the middle of the page on page 7. Leave we the song, the king is here. Creon, Menoxius' son, draws near to the function strange, like the heaven-sent change, which has raised him newly to power. What counsel urging, what ends of state that he summons us to deliberate? The elders all by his heralds call at a strange, unwanted hour. Creon, sirs, for the ship of state, the gods once more, after much rocking on a stormy surge, set her on even keel. Now therefore you of all others, by my summoners I bade come hither, having found you first, right loyal ever to the kingly power in Laius' time, and next while Oedipus ordered the commonwealth, and since his fall, with steadfast purposes abiding still, circling their progeny. Now since they perished both on one day, so is everybody clear on who they is? Okay, all right, so this is Oedipus' sons. Now since they perished both on one day, slain by a two-edged fate, striking and stricken, sullied with the stain of mutual fratricide, I, as you know, in right of kinship nearest to the dead, possess the throne and take the supreme power. Howbeit, it is impossible to know the spirit of any man, purpose or will, before it be displayed by exercise in government and laws. To me, I say, now as of old, that pilot of the state who sets no hand to the best policy, but remains tongue-tied through some terror, seems vilest of men. Him too, who sets a friend before his native land, I prize at nothing. God, who seest all things always, witness it. If I perceive where safety should have been, mischief advancing toward my citizens, I will not sit in silence, nor account as friend to me the country's enemy. But thus I deem, she is our ark of safety. And friends are made then only when, embarked upon her deck, we ride the seas upright. Such are the laws by which I mean to further this city's welfare. And akin to these, I have given orders to the citizens touching the sons of Oedipus. Eteocles, who in this city's quarrel fought and fell, the foremost of our champions in the fray, they should entomb with the full sanctity of rites that psalmize the downward road of their dead greatest. Him, the while, his brother, that Polynices, who, returning home a banished man, sought to lay waste with fire his household gods, his native country, sought to glut himself with his own kindred's blood, or carry them away to slavery. It was then promulgated to the city, no man shall bury, none should wail for him. Unsepulchred, shamed in the eyes of men, his body shall be left to be devoured by dogs and fowls of the air. Such is my will. Never with me shall wicked man usurp the honors of the righteous. But whoever is friendly to this city shall, by me, living or dead, be honored equally. So there are a couple of things that, let's see, where was it? There's a line here. Did you want to say
The
something?
leader, in this translation, he's called the leader, the next speaker. That, it's interesting what he says following this speech.
What is there?
So,
Creon, we hear your pleasure both on this city's friend and on her foe. It is your sovereignty's prerogative to pass with absolute freedom on the dead and us who have survived them. Is that what you're
yeah,
talking
so this
about?
idea, this is interesting, like this city leader is basically saying that Creon has power over both the living and the dead. Like there's already this kind of inordinate supremacy that they're lending to him that's going to be challenged.
Mhm.
Like by the end of the play, we realize he doesn't have power over either of those, really.
Right.
In this translation, it says, "We know you have the power to wreak your will upon the living and the dead."
It's like you're dictating, you do what you want.
Yeah.
But I guess my question when I started first reading this was, does he really? Because, I mean, I didn't know if the gods, what I had brought this up in our discussion, if that was tradition, like everybody should get buried, or was there a time when it was okay to not bury somebody? And was Creon making it, I mean, by the end, he's making a mistake, but at the beginning, you know, was he allowed to say, oh, okay, we're not going to bury that guy? Because in my mind, by what Antigone had said, it was like, well, you know, I mean, maybe it was more familiar with her, you know, he's my brother, I'm going to bury him. But I just didn't know if there was a tradition of saying, okay, well, you know, they're doomed to Hades and the terrible life, so we're not going to bury them. Or was burial the custom for everyone?
Well, it's a good question. I think the general rule was, you need to bury the dead. Now, that being said, there was, I read someplace that there exceptions would be made if a person was a traitor. Let's just put it this way. It was not unheard of to leave an enemy unburied. Okay? But it still would have been somewhat unusual. So Creon's he's kind of in this gray area here. I mean, what he's wanting to do is, it's not really normally acceptable, but this is an unusual circumstance. So, it's one of those little gray areas.
I think it's hard for us to understand because we think of a dead body as just being, you know, something to be we don't, hopefully, as Catholics, but our culture thinks of a dead body as something that the person is not making use of anymore, and so we can discard it. However, I mean, now they're making compost. Yeah, I just saw, I think it's today, that SpaceX is taking the remains of people out into space. Isn't that romantic? You know, and
What?
Yeah, they're gonna leave, I think they're cremains. They're gonna release them into our atmosphere.
It's already
It's
been
just-
done.
Okay.
Oh.
So there's all this, but we don't think of the body, we don't think of the body as still being, as being actually an integral part of the person, like they do. And so they have this horror that if you leave a body unburied, there are consequences for that person in the afterlife.
Right. Well, they can't enter into Hades.
Right.
They become,
Oh, they're just lost or something.
right. So for instance, in Homer, which they would have known, they leave Circe's island,
Right.
and there's this kind of dopey sailor, Elpenor, that goes up on top of the roof and gets hammered, and then he hears it's time to go, and he forgets he's on a roof, and he takes a step off and falls down and breaks his neck, and then, you know, they have to leave, and so they leave him unburied, and you know, it turns out Odysseus is, you know, the spirit appears to him and says, look, you've got to give me burial rights. Otherwise, you just sort of flit around. There's no finality.
Yeah.
So there would have been, for that to happen to you would have been something that you would, which is kind of funny in a way, because, you know, okay, great, you get to go to Hades, so that sounds like a great deal,
Right.
too, you know?
Right.
I mean, I know, but it's better than just flitting around and there's no rest. I suppose that finally
That's it.
you are where you've gone, so, yes, certainly there would be religious reasons why this should be done.
Yeah.
But sometimes we don't follow our religion, our own traditions.
That was Antigone's very first argument with Creon, that you're putting yourself above Zeus.
Maybe I missed it somewhere, but did they, at this time, believe in the separation of body and soul? Did they believe that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I kind of thought they did, but I wasn't positive.
But it's not such a, it's not the kind of distinction, they don't conceive of human beings as being a ghost in a shell. It's not a, that the body is actually a part of who the person is. And then the soul departs from the body, but the body's still somehow, yeah,
Still part of the same identity.
yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and so somehow what you're doing,
To the
how you
body.
treat the body has consequences for the experience of the soul in the afterlife.
That's
They would,
soul, but
so
not
for
soul.
instance, when they would always put a coin under the tongue of the corpse so that he could pay, a harem, the ferryman who takes you across the river Styx. So somehow, like, he's going to need this, and so they put it, and somehow that's going to be able to pay that debt. There's,
You know, there's a word in here, I don't know if I actually don't think it's in here. But it's sacred. It's a sacred realm to all of this that's going on. And it's relative to our feelings about burial. And I think that's what Antigone is trying to express in all the words that she has. This is sacred to her. And it's important because of its sacred nature. And I also think that this is a cause for her drawing that line in the sand.
yeah.
in her life.
Anthropologists debate about when religion emerged, and a number of them feel that even like Neanderthals were religious in some sense, and their argument for this is because there is evidence that they practiced burial. And so even today, we somehow recognize that burial has a religious overtone, and when we see people burying, we see somehow that's a religious act. That's interesting. That it might be almost our primordial religious act.
So if we even apply it to things that maybe should be applied to, like burying goldfish.
I know,
I was
right?
having a liturgy. Or burying
extended
It's true.
beyond ourselves.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, 1,500 years later, Judas he was a betrayer, and he wasn't buried. There was a special place that they took his body, or,
No, he's buried, but he's not, yeah,
it was not, it was,
it's a,
I can't remember what they called it.
Potter's Field.
yeah.
Potter's Field.
Well, in
No,
the
no.
field of blood. Well, no, that's where he
That's where the,
he
that's
dies.
where the
But they turn it into a place for foreigners to be buried.
I don't know.
Were they
I
buried?
don't think we know. I
Were
don't
they
think we know
buried?
whether
Or were they
Judas was
thrown
buried or
into
not.
I'm sure he was buried.
I don't think we know that.
But
I think he
that's
was, I think he was probably buried. Did anybody see Risen? Yes, a few times.
That's well, right there.
And, no, I mean, it was actually a firm does research it, but the burial area, like after they crucified, after the Romans crucified, did you see that? Where
Yes.
And they throw them in there, and it's just bodies stacked up a lot like during the Holocaust.
Yeah.
Right. They're just these bodies you have to dispose of.
Yeah.
And so he was probably gathered somehow. I would doubt if anybody gave him his new tomb.
We don't know, okay.
I assume they had a Jewish funeral, Jewish ones.
I don't know. I bet the people that paid him did some. Well, I wouldn't bet. I don't trust those guys. I wouldn't count on Ananias and all those guys to bury somebody that they used.
But
It
with,
wasn't a criminal.
with Creon, but it's easy for us to,
Right.
as Christians, to look and say, this would be an offense to God, right? So, we look at this as, one of the corporal acts of mercy. But in his context, he's doing it to please the gods, right?
That's right.
Um,
On